not by the testimony of the reporters of two great English newspapers, which to their and England's glory told the people of England of the shameful things that were being done in Ireland in their name. Even so, mutiny was not something lightly undertaken by regular soldiers of the British Army, not in those days. Mutiny had not yet come to mean walking out of barracks and holding a press conference because one had been asked to polish one's buttons. It was a grave offense involving grave consequences. And as well, there was a man's pride in his service and in his regiment. This was a consideration with Frank Geraghty, whom I talked with in his home at Castle Blaney, County Monaghan.
The mutiny at that time hurt me more because I had served in France from January 1915 until the end of the war, and having been wounded twice. And to spoil all my service by a mutiny, I fully realized what I was doing. But the news coming from Ireland disturbed my mind to such an extent that I was prepared, quite prepared to suffer anything, irrespective of what it might be.
In May 1936, Lieutenant Colonel H.F.N. Jourdain, the last Lieutenant Colonel of the Connaught Rangers, wrote to a London newspaper about the mutiny. In that letter, Colonel Jourdain spoke of the men of the Connaught Rangers being, as he put it, led astray by the accounts they'd received of the actions of the Black and Tans. It appeared to be the Colonel's view that the main cause of the discontent that exploded in mutiny was a great amount of hardship, quite unnecessary and quite avoidable, as he described it, that had been inflicted on the battalion in the summer of 1920, like exhaustive training and forced marches in temperatures of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And it ought to be said that not every soldier of the Connaught Rangers at Jalander was disturbed by the news from Ireland or thought it justified mutiny. Sergeant William Edwards was born in Essex, but now lives in Dublin, having become, as is the habit of Englishmen who marry Irish women, more Irish than the Irish themselves. But even today, looking back, ex-Sergeant Edwards holds strictly to the professional soldier's view of mutiny. He thought the men of the Connaught Rangers owed at least the same loyalty to the regiment and to their oath as the men of the French Foreign Legion.
No, I don't think there's any right on the side. They should not have broke their oath of allegiance. I looked on them, a legion there in the French army in the desert. He had hard knocks to do. He took an oath and he was forced to carry that oath out wherever it was possible for it to be forced out, and they were under the same conditions. Black and Tans, we only practically knew on second-hand information of what was going on. But the morning that the mutiny broke out, they had just received a mail, and it was getting issued out to them. And it appeared to me that they were obsessed with the idea of getting home. Mutiny was not in their heads at the start. They wanted to get home. They looked for their independence or deserted otherwise. Once they got home, I say now that if the thing had been handled right, there'd be no mutiny.
I spoke to another man who was then serving with the battalion as a lance corporal. Irish born and bred, he fought for Britain in both world wars and took a different view from some I've quoted of events in Ireland during and after the First War.
We were regular soldiers. What had Ireland got to do with us? As I said to a couple of men who were sitting with me, I put my trophy on, my helmet, and I said, everything underneath, that's my country. Not that I didn't sympathise with my country, in a vague kind of way, but I'd no love for the ship. After all, I'd been at war in France and in other countries when they were agitating at home. And their principal support in Ireland came because they were against conscription. Therefore all the fine big healthy farmer sons knew that if they backed them up they'd be safe, they wouldn't be conscripted.
That cynical soldier of fortune was Corporal of the Guard when the first move of the mutiny was made. So we'll hear from him again soon. That first move was made by Joe Hawes on the evening of June 27th, 1920.
I went to Private Gogarty, and I went to Private Sweeney, and Private Lally, and Private Daly, a brother of Jim Daly, the man who was executed. I made arrangement with him to meet him in the canteen on the night of the 27th of June, 1920. And I put it up to them that we were doing in India what the Black and Tans were doing in Ireland. And I said to them, lads, what are we going to do about this? They said we should do something. And I said, well, there's only one thing for it. We'll refuse to soldier any more here in India until the British forces are withdrawn from Ireland and until Ireland gets her independence, which is entitled.
The one thing for it was decided at that canteen meeting, was the gesture of protest, more or less traditional in the British Army, of volunteering for the guardroom, of refusing to soldier and voluntarily offering oneself to be locked up. Eventually, 4 men took this step: Private Hawes, Sweeney, Gogarty, and Lally. William Daly, brother of Jim, withdrew. The 4 decided to present themselves at the guardroom the following morning. But meantime, they seemed to have decided that they could not conscientiously even accept a comfortable bed of breakfast from the British Army. They went from the canteen to a disused room in one of the bungalows, as barrack buildings in India were called, and barricading the door, slept fully clothed on the bare floorboards. Joe Hawes takes up the story on the morning of June 28th.
We arrived at the guard room, and there was a Sergeant Shaw, sergeant of the guard. He said, where are you going? And I said, we want to be confined to the guard room as we're protesting against the atrocities of the British forces in Ireland. He didn't want to put us into the guard room, but we persisted so much that he said, well, I'll have to confine you. No, he confined the 4 of us and locked us up in the guard room.
Actually, Hawes' memory was at fault here. The commander of the guard, the sergeant, was absent having breakfast at the time, and the corporal of the guard was temporarily in charge. He was our friend, the cynical soldier of fortune.
So I looked at them, and I thought, well, they've been out all night, and they want a day in the guardroom to sleep it off and have a rest so that they can face trial tomorrow morning. So I put them in. There was a big grill between where the guard lived and prisoners. There were about 5 prisoners in there. Regular customers. So I unlocked the door in the centre of this grill. You could see straight through. It ran across from wall to wall. And put them in. Shaw, come back. Shaw came out. He said, what are those men doing in there? So I told him. Oh, he said, rubbish, get them out. So I took them out, and they said the same thing to him. He said, put them back.
The 4 volunteers for the guardroom soon had company. Rumour of their gesture spread, and it was taken up by others. By midday, there were 35 men confined in the guardroom at their own request, declaring that they would soldier no more for Britain until Ireland was free. They included one of the men on guard, who threw down his rifle and equipment and joined the others behind the grill. This was the situation when one of the companies at Yolanda returned to barracks from the rifle range and halted close by the guardroom. As they stood there, they could hear the men confined in the guardroom shouting Irish rebel slogans and singing Irish rebel songs. It was then that the commanding officer of the regiment, Colonel Deacon, arrived. He gave orders that the 35 voluntary prisoners should be brought outside and addressed them in the hearing of the others. Joe Hawes told me of the Colonel's speech.
I am, he said, your Colonel, and I am proud to be your Colonel. And he didn't want to demonstrate about the great honours that there was in the Connaught Rangers flag. They fought in Spain, they fought in different places, and that the regiment was second to none. In fact, he was actually crying, and he made such a great speech that I was afraid that he had the men convinced. He said, go to your bungalows, and he said, it'll be all forgotten. And I was afraid that those men would go to their bungalows because they were nearly persuaded by the Colonel. So I stepped forward and I said, well, I said, Colonel, I said, I know, I said, the Connaught Rangers has a great flag and a proud flag, but all the honour was for England. There was none of them for poor old Ireland. And the action that we are taking today can go up on the top of the flag and will be the proudest flag of them all because it will be the only one for Ireland.
whether or not it was the effect of this intervention of Joe Hawes, but not only did they 35 refuse release and themselves march back into the guardroom, but the majority of the 100-odd men and parade refused to be dismissed to their bungalows, and breaking ranks crowded around the guardroom with offers of support for the men inside. They demanded their release from the sergeant of the guard, and he eventually gave way. The accounts of what happened immediately afterwards are as confused as the situation itself must have been. But piecing them together, it seems fairly clear that from that moment the mutineers were in effective control of the barracks at Jolanda, with the battalion's officers remaining strangely inactive for a time. It later transpired that only a tiny minority of the men involved were wholeheartedly behind the ringleaders. But meantime, Joe Hawes and his comrades seem to have been in command.
We went to the regiment of Yale, and somebody proposed that we should form a committee, because somebody should speak for the troops, see, as a whole. So there were 7 of us proposed as 7 delegates to represent the battalion. And the men agreed with a show of hands. I was one of them. Then we told the men to go back to their bungalows again and wait for further orders, would take no orders from any officers except they took it from the committee which they were after elected. Now when the committee was elected, the men went back to their bungalows as we told them to do. And we drew up a programme for the men to carry out.
Myself and another young soldier, Kelly, Patrick Kelly from Kilbeggan, we went into the Indian Bazaar, the Jolanda Bazaar, and we took down all the Union Jacks, and we got material made, green, white and gold, into a flag, 6 foot by 4 foot, and fastened onto a pole, which I in turn, with Private Kelly, went back to the encampment, went up the stairs and onto the roof of the bungalow and hoisted the tricolour there.
Tom Turney added some more details of the meeting in the regimental theatre, described by Hawes, and of the orders issued by the committee which the men elected, Joe Hawes's committee.
They told us that there'd been no rowdyism, or that there'd been nothing disorderly allowed to go on. They said that any man that was not in sympathy with the cause, there'd be no prejudice against him. He was at liberty to take his kit and equipment and go to the artillery barracks and remain alive. Well, in my opinion, that was the grandest thing that was done, for the simple reason as this, that there was a lot of the soldiers there had long service. There was a lot of soldiers there whose families was married and had their families in the country. There was a lot of men that wasn't belonging to our country.
And some men, Turney told me, took advantage of the offer. There were only 2 companies of the Connaught Rangers in barracks at Jolanda at this time. It was the time of year when our troops in India and almost all their wives and children took spells in the cooler hill stations away from the fierce heat of the plains, and in June 1920 A Company of the Rangers was in the Punjab hills at Jaktog and C Company at Solan. It was decided by the committee at Jolanda to send emissaries to both these stations to appeal for the support of the men stationed there. None of the mutineers I spoke to were very clear about who went to A Company at Jaktog, but if there was anyone, his mission failed. Frank Garrity was the emissary to Solan, where the soldiers of C Company included Private James Joseph Daly.
On the 30th of June, 1920, I, with the Private Patrick Kelly, were detailed to go to Solan and the similar hills to communicate the fact that the troops in Jolanda had mutinied, and to give the reason for the mutiny, and to give instructions also that the mutiny, if they did mutiny, would be on the lines of passive resistance with no violence. Our appeal to James Joseph Daly, whom I approached as the most competent man and whom I knew personally, was to carry out an effort to start a mutiny. Daly, I knew, was inclined to the Republican movement in Ireland and had not, as I had, been to France. He was one of the men, like a good many more of the mutineers, who had joined the British Army after the 1418 war was finished.
Unfortunately for Jim Daly, and not entirely through his fault, the passive resistance plan at Solon fell through. Garrity and his fellow ambassador were arrested and confined in the guardroom almost immediately after they'd contacted Daly, but the fuse had been lit. On the morning of June 29th, Colonel Jackson of the headquarters staff arrived at Jalunda. Joe Hawes tells what happened.
He was a Roscommon man. And he came into the barracks and he had a white flag in his car when he came in, a flag of truce. And his car was searched by some of the sentries. But he said he knew the calibre of the Irishmen, as he was an Irishman himself, and knew how honourable they were, that they wouldn't touch him. We went into the orderly room, over which the tricolour flag was flying, and he met the 7 of us inside there, and we discussed the whole matter with him. He wanted to bring in troops into the barracks to disarm us, but we wouldn't have that. We put up a council proposal to his, and our proposal was this, that we'd appoint our own men to collect up the arms and store them in a bungalow, and that we'd put a mutineer's guard over the arms, that when the British forces would come in to take over the barracks, the mutineer's guard would present arms to them. He had to agree with it, because he said he knew the fighting calibre of the Connaught Rangers, and he knew the fight that we'd put up.
There seems to be some conflict between this statement and the passive resistance policy which the mutineers claimed they were operating, for they also said that they would hand over their arms to the British forces. But if Irishmen can't be illogical, who can? Anyway, the end of the mutiny at Jalunda was at hand. The barracks were surrounded by 2 regiments of infantry, artillery and machine gunners, all ready to go into action. On July the 1st, the infantry, Seaforths and South Wales Borderers, marched in and were greeted by the Rangers with a cheer.